Hello everybody and happy Easter, because today is Easter Sunday. It is time for another wrap-up where I tell you what I read in the past week. I have 4 things today, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them because the first one, the Calcutta Chromosome by Amitav Ghosh, is an Arthur C. Clarke Award winner, and I'll be talking about this at the end of the month and a wrap-up with all the other Clarke Award winners that I finish in April. The short version is that this felt like it should have been just straight historical fiction, maybe alternative history, but it tries to introduce a science fictional or speculative element. I guess that Ghosh is not a sci-fi writer, and this just felt like somebody who didn't understand science fiction trying to write science fiction, but I really enjoyed the parts of it that just read like alt history fiction instead. That was cool. Most of it concerns kind of like uncovering a conspiracy behind the scenes of scientific achievements, specifically about malaria, and I was super into that. Right up to the point when the ending wrapped up nothing, answered no questions, and was just odd. It was a really disappointing ending, but I will talk about stuff in more detail later. The next book I read was The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. This is a middle grade fantasy novel, and I have to say up front that I read this entire book on a day when I was feeling really irritable. And as you know, because I recently made a video about why I haven't been enjoying my reading as much this year, this has been a problem, but on this particular day it was really a problem. So I feel like I'm going to be kind of unfair to this book in saying that I didn't enjoy it all that much, that I had some problems with it. This, to me, when I was reading it, I was thinking 2 things. This is another story about a very special snowflake, and the writing is supposed to be very beautiful. I think Kelly Barnhill is known for her prose, and I thought it relied very heavily on repetition, kind of twee repetition, and that irritated me. But disregarding those 2 things, the book is still fine, and it just pressed my buttons on that day. So let's see if I can explain the story, however. Basically, there's this city or town called the Protectorate where they believe that they have to sacrifice the youngest child born every year to the witch in the woods to placate her, because apparently the witch tried to kill them all hundreds of years ago. So one year, a little girl is given up, her mother doesn't want to give her up, and she goes mad and crazy and is locked up, and the little girl is sacrificed. But it turns out that there is a witch in the forest. She's not evil. She actually rescues the babies and finds them good homes. She doesn't know why the Protectorate is abandoning babies in the woods. She doesn't want to go there because they're super depressing and gloomy and sad, and she just wants to help the babies. This particular little girl, though, is special, and the witch kind of falls in love with her and adopts her as her own child and raises her, and accidentally feeds her moonlight, which makes her magical. And the little girl, now called Luna, has so much magic inside of her that they kind of bind it until she is older and can control it. And then the story fast forwards to when she is almost 13 and her magic is coming loose again, is becoming freed, and everything is unraveling about why the Protectorate is the way it is and what happened to the little girl and her mother and everything, you know, bringing down the establishment basically, and who really is the wicked evil witch in the story. So it was a good story about a lot of emotions, basically about sorrow mainly being like the thematic emotion here. I don't think I understood what the story was trying to say about sorrow or joy or whatever, just that it's bad when people are depressed and kept under the heel of the patriarchy, and little girls with lots of magic can solve this. I'm not trying to be sarcastic, I just don't think I wrapped my head around it entirely. Anyway, it was a good middle grade novel, just not quite my thing right now. Then I finally got back to reading The Apollo Quartet by Ian Sales, and I read the second novella, which is The Eye with Which the Universe Beholds Itself. Like the other stories in the series, this is kind of an alternate history retelling of the Apollo missions, though really it's just alt history, and it has a connection to the Apollo missions. It's much more far future than that. And it's about how the US has had its first base on another planet for about 15 years, but they can't see it anymore. They think it's disappeared, so they're sending this man there to check out what happened to it. And the question is, why are they sending him? What is it about his background that makes him like the only person who can go find out what happened to this base? And that relates to the fact that he is the first and only human being who's been to Mars, and maybe what he found on Mars relates to what happened to the missing base. So it's kind of two timelines. You have the story from about 1999 and 2000 when he's going to this other planet, and then flashing back to what happened and what he found on Mars about 20 years prior. I just thoroughly enjoyed this. I liked the setup of the story, and it worked in this shorter length. It was like a perfect little story to tell in a novella length work. If it had been a full novel, I think I would have enjoyed it just as much. It would have had more detail, more of the implications might have been spelled out, but as it is, this was just a very solid sci-fi story with that alt history feel. Like, this is definitely more futuristic feeling than the other stories in the series I've read, because it gets away from the very 70s stuff. The only thing that feels old is that the technology and the operations and stuff are very Apollo mission, and all that terminology is used. Everything is very bulky and closed in, and everything very manual rather than being driven by computers and such. And I like that aesthetic, but I also like that it did manage to feel like retro futuristic too. Anyway, I really like this, and I have been impressed at how much I have liked all the stories in this quartet so far. I have the third one left to read. I don't own it yet, I need to get it. And I believe there's a shorter short story or novelette that was published in 2016 that I may also try out if it's any good. And the final thing I have to talk about is After the Crown by K.B. Wagers, which is the second book in the Indronan War. This is the sequel to Behind the Throne, which I read last year, and I thought the first book was good. Like, it was a lot of fun. It had very interesting characters. It was building some very interesting relationships, but the writing was weak. It was definitely debut novel wobbly. So with After the Crown, I fully expected to see stronger prose and continuing on with this really big cast of characters, fleshing them out more and building on those relationships, and I think I got exactly what I expected. This series is about a woman, Hale, who ran away from her royal family. Her mother was the empress of the Indronan Empire, and she lived as a gun runner for about 20 years, and then in the first book she's dragged home by some trackers to be the next empress because her sisters have been assassinated and her mother was suffering from dementia and dying. And Hale is like the last person anybody wants to see as empress, and she doesn't want the job, but she's the only person who can inherit the throne. And the first book is about her coming to power and a lot of the assassination attempts and trying to find out who in the royal court and in the capital city and such was involved in the conspiracy against her family. And that continues into the second book, though in this case Hale is now being super active in defending her kingdom and trying to take action against the Saxon kingdom, which is on the brink of war with the Indronan Empire. And I like this a lot. I think the only negative thing I can say about it is that it should have been edited a bit better. Wagers' prose is a lot better. She's not relying so much on really excessive emotional descriptions. Just some of the things that she said about her characters in the first one was like, if people were that excessive with their displays of emotion, they'd be having heart attacks from emoting so much. That is much, much more toned down in this book. But I kid you not, the phrase he, she, or whatever raised an eyebrow is used all the time. Like, other facial expressions of sarcasm and surprise and everything, they exist. Other expressions exist. Stop using the eyebrows so much. It's one of those things that when you notice it for the first time, or maybe for the 10th time, you suddenly will never be able to not notice it. So it was a bit of a pet peeve at the end of this book. But that's really the only thing I have to say bad about the book. I continue to enjoy the characters a lot. I really like the relationships, and I'm actually kind of sad that there's only going to be one more book in this trilogy. I think there's a huge potential for a very long continuing story about Hale and the Indronan Empire and so on. It makes me kind of wonder if Wagers will try to launch a second series set in the same universe afterwards, maybe focusing on a different main character, or maybe something kind of like C.J. Cherry's Foreigner series, which is like a series of trilogies all about the same people. I don't know, there's something about this series, and maybe this book in particular, that had me thinking of the Foreigner series. There's something about the assassination attempts and the bodyguards and the political intrigues and stuff that reminds me very much of the situation in the first couple of Foreigner books, and I love those books so much. So yeah, really highly recommended. I think the first book is a lot of fun despite its weaknesses, and the second book is a huge improvement. That's it for what I read this past week. There are some okay things there. What I'm reading right now, however, I'm like really enthusiastic about, so I'm looking forward to doing next week's wrap-up already. So yeah, I hope you're enjoying your Easter weekend, and I will talk to you again tomorrow, and until then, bye.